The road wound through the valley like a ribbon of gray silk, bordered by whispering pines and the sound of water sliding over stones. Ethan leaned his head against the window, watching as the late afternoon light flickered through the trees. His father, David, drove with one hand on the steering wheel and the other tapping lightly to a song on the radio. In the back seat sat Robert, David's old friend, quiet and composed, a faint smile resting on his face as he looked out at the mountains ahead. It had been years since Ethan last joined them on a trip. College, work, and distance had built invisible walls between him and the easy warmth of his childhood. When his father suggested a weekend camping getaway, Ethan had hesitated. But the thought of clean air and a pause from deadlines had won him over. The closer they came to the campsite, the quieter the world became. No signal, no messages, no city noise, just the hush of leaves brushing the wind. Ethan watched Robert from the corner of his eye. There was something deliberate about the man's movements, something steady. He carried calm like a second skin. Every few minutes, Robert would ask if Ethan was comfortable or if he needed a break. It wasn't intrusive, just thoughtful. When they finally reached the campsite, the sun was already lowering behind the ridge. A lake shimmered below, glassy and pale, reflecting streaks of orange. David parked the truck and clapped his hands together. "We're here. 2 days, no phones, no worries." They unloaded the bags, the tent, and the cooler. The forest smelled of pine resin and earth, the kind of air that made you breathe deeper. Ethan stretched his arms, feeling muscles loosen. Robert started unpacking the tent poles, moving efficiently while David fumbled with the instructions. Ethan joined Robert, and for the first time since the trip began, they spoke more than a few words. "You've done this before?" Ethan asked, holding one of the poles. Robert chuckled softly. "More times than I can count. Your dad used to drag me out here every summer when we were your age. He'd get the directions wrong, and I'd have to fix everything." Ethan smiled, glancing toward his father, who was now arguing with a tarp. "Some things never change." The moment drew a quiet laugh from Robert. It wasn't forced, it felt genuine, light, and unexpectedly easy. The conversation flowed as they worked, and when the tent was finally upright, they both stood back to admire it. As night fell, they built a small fire. The flames threw golden light on their faces, flickering across Robert's eyes. David told old stories about college days, half of them exaggerated, but Ethan listened with amusement. The air carried a faint chill, and the stars began to appear, scattered like salt across an endless dark. Ethan found himself studying Robert more than he intended. The man's voice was deep, deliberate, and calm. Each word seemed weighed before it was spoken. His laughter was quiet but sincere, his eyes reflective when the conversation turned to memories. At one point, David went to the truck to fetch something, leaving Ethan and Robert by the fire. The silence between them was comfortable. Robert stirred the embers with a stick, the firelight outlining the lines on his hands. "Your father talks about you a lot," Robert said without looking up. "Says you're working too hard. That you barely sleep." Ethan smiled faintly. "He exaggerates. But, yeah, maybe I've been a little lost in things lately." "Lost isn't always bad," Robert replied. "Sometimes it means you're searching for something that matters." Ethan looked at him, surprised by the quiet depth of the comment. It wasn't advice, it was recognition. He wanted to ask what Robert had been searching for, but something in the man's distant gaze stopped him. Instead, he said, "You sound like you've done a lot of searching yourself." Robert's eyes lifted to the stars. "More than I'd like to admit." The sound of footsteps announced David's return, and the moment passed like a ripple on still water. They cooked a simple dinner over the fire, beans, sausages, and bread, and laughed at how half of it burned. It wasn't a feast, but it felt like one after the long drive. Later, the temperature dropped. The night turned sharp and wind began to move through the trees. When Ethan went to check the tent, he found one of the poles had bent slightly. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. "Looks like a storm's rolling in," Robert said, glancing at the clouds. "We should make sure the shelter's steady." They worked together to reinforce the tent, hands brushing occasionally as they adjusted ropes and tightened knots. The air felt charged, not just from the approaching storm, but from something unspoken building between them. It wasn't attraction exactly, it was recognition, a strange connection that didn't fit easily into words. By the time rain began to fall, steady and cold, they were all inside the tent. The storm intensified, the sound of water drumming against the fabric. David was already half asleep, wrapped in his blanket, murmuring something incoherent. Ethan tried to settle in, but the cramped space made movement awkward. Robert shifted slightly, giving Ethan more room. "Sorry about this," he said quietly. "We didn't expect the weather to turn." "It's fine," Ethan whispered. "It's peaceful, in a way." Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the air was warm and still. The faint scent of rain mixed with the lingering smoke from the fire. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of breathing, rain, and the heartbeat of the storm around them. Ethan lay awake, eyes tracing the faint outlines of the tent illuminated by distant lightning. Robert's steady breathing beside him was strangely grounding. He thought about what Robert had said, about searching, and wondered what it meant to find something, or someone, that changed how you saw yourself. Sleep came slowly, drifting in and out between thunderclaps. Before it took him fully, Ethan heard Robert whisper, almost to himself, "Some storms never really pass, they just teach you how to stay still." Ethan didn't answer. The words settled in his mind like a secret, something to be remembered later. When morning came, the rain had stopped, and mist hung over the trees like a soft veil. David was already outside, boiling water for coffee. Ethan unzipped the tent, stepping into the damp air. The world smelled clean, almost new. Robert stood near the lake, hands in his pockets, staring at the reflection of the clouds. Something about that image, quiet, thoughtful, alone, etched itself into Ethan's memory. He didn't know why, but he knew this trip would not fade easily. It had started as an escape, a small weekend to reset. But now, it felt like the beginning of something he didn't yet understand. The morning light touched the water, and for a moment, everything seemed balanced, the calm after the storm, the silence before understanding. Ethan breathed deeply, unsure of what waited beyond that stillness, but certain that the story of this weekend had only just begun. The morning after the storm was unnervingly still. The mountains wore a fresh layer of mist, and the air outside the cabin smelled clean, too clean, as though the night before had been washed away. Ethan woke to silence, broken only by the slow crackle of new firewood and the faint sound of water dripping from the roof. His head felt heavy, not from wine, but from everything that had gone unsaid. Caleb stood by the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. His expression was unreadable, calm, almost casual, but something beneath it had changed. His voice when he spoke was soft, careful. "You sleep at all?" Ethan shook his head. "Barely." Caleb handed him a mug. "Yeah. Me neither." They sat across from each other, separated by the narrow table that suddenly felt like a chasm. The quiet wasn't comfortable this time. It was thick, weighted with what they hadn't done but almost had. Ethan stared into his cup, the rising steam blurring his reflection. He wanted to say something, apologize, explain, retreat, but no words fit. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "We should probably head back before the roads ice over." Ethan nodded, grateful for the practicality of the statement. "Yeah. Let's do that." They packed in silence. Every small sound, the zip of a bag, the creak of the floorboards, the closing of drawers, felt exaggerated, like punctuation in a conversation neither wanted to finish. When Caleb brushed past him to grab his jacket, Ethan's heart jumped despite himself. The nearness hurt more than the distance ever could. Before leaving, Ethan stepped outside for air. The sky was pale, the valley below hidden under slow-moving fog. He closed his eyes, letting the cold bite at his skin. He told himself this would fade, that time and reason would erase the sharpness of what had almost happened. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't. Some moments refused to dissolve. Caleb came out behind him. "You ready?" Ethan nodded without turning around. Yeah. The drive down the mountain was quiet. The winding roads felt endless, and each curve brought a new kind of tension, the kind that comes from knowing silence is safer than truth. Caleb focused on the road, his jaw tight, knuckles pale against the steering wheel. Ethan watched the landscape blur past, trees melting into shades of gray and green. He wanted to say something that could make the air lighter, but everything that came to mind felt dishonest. Halfway down, Caleb finally spoke. "You don't have to hate me for last night." Ethan turned to him. "I don't." Caleb's eyes stayed on the road. "Then what do you feel?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "Confused. Guilty. Maybe both." "About me?" "About everything." Caleb gave a faint nod, almost to himself. "I didn't plan it, you know." "I know." Ethan paused. "That doesn't make it easier." They drove the rest of the way in silence. By the time they reached the highway, the sun had climbed above the trees, melting what little snow remained. The world looked ordinary again, and that felt like a lie. When Caleb dropped him off at his apartment, he didn't kill the engine. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt but didn't move to leave. For a long moment, they sat in stillness. Caleb broke it first. "Take care of yourself, Ethan." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "You too." He stepped out, closed the door, and stood on the curb as the truck pulled away. The sound of its tires faded into city noise until it was gone entirely. For the first time in days, Ethan felt utterly alone. Inside, Ryan was home early. He looked up from the couch, smiling with that easy familiarity Ethan had always found comforting. "Hey, you're back sooner than I thought. How was it?" Ethan managed a smile. "Peaceful." Ryan stood, stretching, then crossed over to hug him. "You needed it." Ethan let himself be held, but it felt strange, like fitting into a shape that no longer matched perfectly. Ryan smelled like coffee and cedar soap, the same as always. Nothing had changed here, and that was the problem. As the evening went on, Ryan talked about work, about a project deadline, about weekend plans. Ethan listened, nodding at the right moments, pretending everything was fine. But part of him still lingered in that cabin, by the fire, in the sound of rain, in Caleb's voice whispering truths neither could bear to hold. Later that night, while Ryan slept, Ethan sat by the window with his phone. One unread message glowed on the screen. "Caleb, I didn't plan it. But I don't regret feeling something real." Ethan's thumb hovered over the delete button. He didn't reply. Instead, he locked the screen and set the phone face down. But the words stayed, echoing like a heartbeat. He stared out at the city lights scattered across the dark. It was strange how easily life resumed, how routine could disguise turmoil. Yet inside, a quiet storm still moved. Guilt pressed at him, but beneath it lay something harder to name, a longing not for what happened, but for what it revealed. He wondered what it said about him, that a single weekend could shake years of certainty. That a glance, a touch, a near mistake could make him question what he thought he knew about love and loyalty. By midnight, the room had gone completely still. Ryan shifted in his sleep, murmuring something unintelligible. Ethan watched him, the faint rise and fall of his chest, the trust in his unguarded face. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the distance between them, but couldn't. The space felt sacred now, something he wasn't sure he had the right to cross. When dawn approached, pale and thin, Ethan still hadn't slept. He went to the kitchen, made coffee, and stood by the window as the first light touched the skyline. His reflection looked older, quieter, changed in ways no one would notice. He thought of the mountains, of how they seemed eternal from afar, but up close, every surface told a story of erosion, of weather, of time reshaping even the strongest stone. Maybe people weren't so different. Caleb would fade, he told himself. The memory would dull, the guilt would soften. But part of him knew better. Some stories don't end, they just become quieter versions of themselves, hidden in the folds of ordinary life. Ethan took a slow breath and whispered to the empty room, "The mountains keep secrets. Then, almost to himself, softer still, so do I. He set the mug down, straightened his posture, and turned toward the day waiting for him, but as the sunlight broke across the room, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted for good, and that the silence he carried from that cabin would follow him long after everything else had been forgotten. Morning arrived wrapped in mist. The lake looked silver and still, a mirror without reflection. I woke to the faint creak of boards downstairs and the smell of coffee drifting through the hall. For a moment, I didn't move. The events of the night before, Mark's lingering gaze, the quiet tension, hung like fog in my mind. When I finally went down, my father was outside with Tom, both already dressed for chores. David sat at the counter, newspaper spread before him, his bare feet tapping softly on the floor. Mark stood near the window, stirring sugar into his mug. He turned as I entered, that same steady calm behind his eyes. "Morning, Ethan," he said. "Sleep well?" "Mostly." "Good." He smiled faintly, like the word carried more weight than it should. The day unfolded in slow fragments. My father and Tom repaired a loose section of dock, their laughter echoing over the water. David cleaned fishing rods, humming tunelessly. Mark joined me near the boathouse, where we sorted through tangled ropes and rusted hooks. The air smelled of lakeweed and sun-warmed pine. "You used to come here often?" I asked that he nodded. "Every summer, for a while." "Your dad, me, David, Tom. We thought the world began and ended at this lake." I looked at him. "And now?" "Now the world feels smaller." He smiled without looking up. "But memories make good company when the noise dies down." Something about the way he said it stayed with me, the hint of weariness behind the ease. His eyes were soft, but there was a gravity there, like he was speaking from a place far older than his years. By noon, the sun broke through, scattering gold across the water. We took the boat out, my father steering, Tom telling stories, David lounging with his feet over the edge. Mark sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders brushed when the boat tilted. Each touch, however small, seemed to last a beat too long. That my father didn't notice, or pretended not to. He talked about old times, names I didn't know, jokes that belonged to another generation. I laughed when expected, but the laughter didn't belong to me. At one point, Mark leaned closer and said quietly, "He doesn't see you clearly, does he?" I turned toward him, startled. "What do you mean?" "He looks at you and still sees a boy. But you've grown in ways he doesn't understand." I didn't answer. The air between us tightened, wordless but full. Later, when we returned, my father disappeared into the shed with Tom, leaving David to light the evening fire. Mark lingered near the porch, polishing a glass absently. "You don't talk much," he said after a while. "I guess I learned from my dad." He chuckled softly. "Maybe. But sometimes silence says more than words." The comment struck deeper than I expected. There was no flirtation in his tone, no teasing, just quiet observation. It made me feel seen in a way that was almost uncomfortable. When dinner came, conversation flowed like warm current, drinks poured, plates passed, laughter rebounding through the room. My father grew louder with every glass, the way men do when they mistake volume for control. Mark, in contrast, spoke sparingly. Each word deliberate, each glance precise. I found myself watching him, the curve of his hand around the glass, the way his voice softened when he addressed me. At one point, David leaned across the table and said, "You look just like your father did at your age, Ethan. Maybe a little less trouble, though." "Don't bet on it," Tom added, earning another round of laughter, but Mark's gaze didn't join the humor. He looked at me for a long moment, then down at his drink. The noise around us faded, and for a breath, it felt like there were only two people in that room. When the plates cleared, the others drifted toward the fire pit outside. The night was thick with the smell of rain, clouds rolling in over the lake. My father sat with Tom and David, trading stories too loud for the calm that surrounded them. Mark stayed behind, collecting bottles, his movements unhurried. "Storm's coming," he said. "I know." He nodded toward the window. "You can feel it in the air before it arrives, like everything's holding its breath. I stood beside him, close enough to hear the low rhythm of his breathing. The rain began as a whisper on the roof, then gathered strength, rattling against the glass. Lightning flared across the lake, white and brief, the power flickered once and died. The room fell into darkness, broken only by the faint glow from the fireplace outside. "Guess we're on candle duty," Mark said quietly. He found a box on the shelf, lit a single wick. The small flame painted his face in shifting gold, the light softening the sharpness of his features. For a while, we didn't speak. The silence wasn't empty, it pulsed with something fragile, unspoken. "Finally," he said, "you remind me of myself at your age." I glanced up. "That's supposed to be a compliment?" He smiled faintly. "Depends who's asking." I laughed, though it came out shaky. He turned to the window again, rain streaking down the glass like veins. "Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who never really see us," he said. "And sometimes the ones who do, aren't supposed to." The words lingered, low and dangerous. Before I could respond, the screen door opened and David's voice called out, "Mark, you hiding from the storm?" He turned away, the moment breaking cleanly, like glass underfoot. "Just waiting for it to pass," he answered. David grinned, stepping inside with a towel draped over his shoulders. "Good luck with that. It's going all night." They spoke easily, old friends resettling into rhythm. I stood back, caught between presence and retreat, unsure which direction to choose. When the lightning flashed again, Mark's eyes met mine across the dim room. There was no smile this time, just an acknowledgement, quiet and deliberate. Outside, thunder rolled across the lake. Inside, laughter rose again, masking what had almost been said. Hours later, after the others had drifted to bed, I found myself awake in the dark. The rain still pressed against the roof, soft and steady. Somewhere below, footsteps moved lightly, then stopped. For a moment, I thought of going down, to speak, to ask, to understand, but I stayed where I was, caught between fear and longing. The lake house groaned with the weight of the storm, its walls whispering with wind and memory. I closed my eyes, knowing something irreversible had begun. Though neither of us had crossed any line, something had shifted in the quiet between us. And even through the noise of the storm, I could still hear Mark's voice. Low, patient, dangerous in its truth. "Sometimes the ones who see us, aren't supposed to."